Welcome back, everyone. This is Mr. Tanner again, and today we're going to be looking at the history of the United States of America. And we're not going to look at the history all the way from the beginning up to present day. Instead, we're going to be focusing this history on some major events. It's skipping over a lot, but some major events that kind of led to the formation of the United States as a country rather than the British colonies. And we're going to start with the first permanent settlement, which was the settlement at Jamestown. Jamestown was settled in modern day Virginia in 1607, and it was the first successful attempt. It wasn't the first settlement in America, but all of the rest kind of broke down within a year. Most of the people that tried to settle the first few places died. Still, a huge portion of the Jamestown residents died. The conditions were very tough, but they ultimately made it through, and Jamestown lasted for over 100 years. So being the first successful settlement in America really spawned a lot more settlements coming into what is now America. And again, that was in 1607 in modern day Virginia. That's where Jamestown was. One other settlement that I want to focus on was the settlement at Plymouth in Massachusetts. It's in modern day Massachusetts. It was settled in 1620, and it's not necessarily the settlement that's so remarkable, but a mistake where the boat landed that led to something really important. So this Plymouth settlement came over on the Mayflower. It's one of the most famous boats during that time. So the Mayflower was supposed to land in Virginia, but it accidentally landed in Massachusetts. And because that happened and it landed in the wrong area, it voided the contract that these sailors were operating under. So their contract no longer was valid, and they had to decide how they wanted to run their government. And what they came up with was the Mayflower Compact, and it was the first example of a democratic self-government. They didn't have to respond to what people abroad wanted. They were able to govern themselves. And ultimately, this is what the United States did. They fought so that they could form their own government. They could have their own self-government. And the first example of this happened at Plymouth from the Mayflower Compact. Also worth noting, this was the site of the first Thanksgiving dinner. It was between the colonists and the Patuxent American Indians. And those Native Americans really taught the colonists how to survive by teaching them how to catch eel, how to grow corn. And the first meal was really celebrating the fact that the colonists would not have survived without the Native Americans. We're going to jump pretty far ahead here to 1773, December 16th, specifically of 1773. And this was the Boston Tea Party. And during this, Boston rioters dumped 342 chests of tea from Britain to protest the taxes that were being issued on the American colonists. And their problem wasn't the fact that they were being taxed. The problem was that they were being taxed despite having no representation within the British government. Part of the Magna Carta, which is their constitution in England, it states that the British government cannot tax anyone who does not have representation within their government. Yet that was happening in the colonies. So the slogan that really issued through America was no taxation without representation. So remember, at the Boston Tea Party, they weren't rioting to leave the British Empire. They're actually rioting to gain representation within the British Empire. Uh, 342 chests of tea might not sound like a lot, but I think it's well over $1 million worth of tea in today's money. So it was a pretty big economic hit that the British Empire would have taken from this event. Next up on the timeline is the American Revolution. The first battle was on April 18th, 1775, and it was the battle at Bunker Hill. Uh, this was the start of the war, but at the beginning of the war, the American colonists were not fighting for their independence yet. At this point, they were fighting to gain representation in the government, and they wouldn't really switch that fight for the independence until Thomas Paine wrote his pamphlet Common Sense, arguing to leave the British Empire. I also think it's interesting enough to mention that even though the first battle was known as the Battle at Bunker Hill, it was not actually fought on Bunker Hill. It was fought on a nearby hill named Breed's Hill, but the name Battle at Bunker Hill stuck. On July 4th, 1776, America had fully embraced the idea of fighting for our independence rather than fighting to gain representation within the British government. In response to that, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and it was signed on July 4th, 1776. John Hancock has the largest signature, being the leader of this uh, Continental Congress, and they signed this into law declaring their independence. It's why we still celebrate our Independence Day every July 4th. And they had to have a lot of courage because if they would have lost the war against the British Empire, which was the largest and strongest military of the time, all of these people would have been killed for treason. And they still had the courage to sign this document, believing what they were doing was right. Next up, we skip forward about 6 years to September 17th, 1781. Sorry, I should say 6 years from the end of the Revolutionary War. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 76. The Revolutionary War ended in 1781 in October. So almost 6 years from the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States ratified or signed into law the U.S. Constitution. Um, Prior to this, we were operating under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation made the central government, the federal government, so weak that they had no power to respond to anything. They couldn't respond to riots. They couldn't respond to uh, crime. They really had nothing that they could do. And people recognized that in an attempt to limit the government, they went too far. The central government couldn't do anything to help our country survive, and they wrote the U.S. Constitution. Uh, Worth noting in the Constitution is the first 10 amendments, the original 10 amendments called the Bill of Rights, and you're going to go over those a little bit later in this unit. Since the Bill of Rights have been written, we have now added 17 more amendments, so there is now 27 amendments in the U.S. Constitution. And then finally, the last bit of information here is the first presidential election, the first presidential terms. So George Washington was elected to be the first president of the United States. His term started on April 30th, 1789. He served two 4-year terms. So his last day in office was March 4th, 1797. There's no reason he couldn't have run again. There was no term limits at this point in the United States, but he decided to step down after having been unanimously elected twice because he didn't want to set up the idea that rulers would lead forever in the United States. That's what a monarchy did, where kings and queens ruled until they died, and he warned against that. And it wasn't until 1936, with the election of FDR, that we ever broke that two-term limit. FDR was ultimately elected 4 times, partly due to his response to the Great Depression and then World War II. But he was very popular, and he was elected 4 times. He died during his fourth term. Harry S. Truman took over from there, and after that, the United States issued 2 term limits for the president. So now a president cannot serve more than 8 years as the president of the United States. That's going to do it for our history of the United States timeline. Keep in mind this is very brief and just highlighting a few important events that led up to the formation of our country. But in 8th grade with U.S. history, you will learn about this in much more detail. Thanks for listening.